Hey all, welcome to Alley Cat Customs. Today we're going to be removing these conventional style lowering springs for this 2000 Chevrolet Silverado and installing a set of long travel double adjustable coilovers. So y'all stick around. All right, so yes, you heard that correctly. We're installing long travel coilovers on a lowered two-wheel drive Chevrolet truck that is going to be a street strip style truck. No, this is not going to be a pre-runner. So why are we installing these long travel coilovers? Well, I'll get into that right now. All right, so with drag racing, the whole goal is to get as much pressure applied to the rear tires so that they have the proper amount of traction to get you down the track or down the street, wherever you're racing at. So you have to get the entire suspension to work properly to get it done. So a lot of people, they'll spend a lot of time and energy building their rear suspension, but a lot of people don't think about what the front suspension has to do to get the job done. Especially on a truck like this. This is a short wheelbase pickup truck, but the weight it's got a whole lot of front percentage weight on this truck. So you have all this weight hanging over the front of the truck that has to get shoved back to put pressure on the rear tires. And I think about this, use an analogy like a hammer. You can take an 8-pound sledgehammer and set it on top of a nail and it won't do anything. You can take a 1-pound hammer and swing it and drive that nail into the ground. And that's what you're trying to do, is you're trying to drive the back tires into the ground so that they have no choice but to hook up and send you down the track. So how do we do that? Well, you've got to pick the nose of the truck up. And the problem with these style springs is the spring rate is so high that it essentially makes the front suspension basically dead. It's not really non-reactive, because the spring rate is so high, it doesn't have to do much work. So there's not a whole lot of potential energy stored in the springs, so that when any weight is moved away from the front, it can react and separate the front of the truck. So that's why you go to a lighter weight spring. But if you know that, as you see in the front of these trucks, you have a very limited amount of distance to put a longer travel, less a lighter spring rate spring in these trucks. And then you go to something with a coilover, and by the time you set a conventional length coilover that would bolt into the upper spring mount and into your lower control arm, it's so short that you don't have the throw to put a light enough spring in place and have the full suspension travel, because you don't want coil bind and you don't want the shock to fully extend and bind. So that's what we're doing, is actually we put Atomic Fab long travel upper control arm mounts, and this is a 7-inch travel front coilover. The reason we're doing that is so that you can have a regular coilover style spring. You can run the normal full length coilover springs to run these style setup. And this we're running out, it's going to be a 650 weight spring on these. So it's going to be adjustable. You can get these coilover springs in about 100-pound increments to really dial in your setup. So by the time we get these springs on here and we get the preload set, get the ride height where we want, we're going to have the right amount of potential energy stored into these springs to really throw the weight up and also be able to drive this thing down the road. A lot of people's going to be wondering, well, if you put a really lightweight spring on a truck, it's going to ride and float and dance on the road. It's going to be a really terrible ride. Well, that's where the double adjustable coilover setup works the best, is because you can really dial in the rate of movement in the front end using your the rebound and compression settings. So even though you may have a light spring to get your potential energy up to throw the front of the truck up, you can adjust it and make it to where you can still drive it down the highway. So we're about to get this front suspension put together, get these installed, and set ride height on this. So let's get started. All right, so first up is to cut the upper coil spring bucket off the frame. I used a plasma cutter, which made pretty easy work of it. Just make sure that you do not damage and cut off the upper control arm brackets, because you will need those to stay on the frame. Once you cut the coil spring bucket off the frame, you will need to clean the frame up where it was cut off at. It needs to be good and clean and smooth so that the upper coilover bracket will weld onto the frame there. And also on the top side of the frame where the upper coil bucket mated to the cross member, you will need to clearance it back so that the coilover bracket will be able to fit over the top of the frame. All right, so now you can see I'm doing a mock-up install of the coilover, and I have the bracket laying against the frame, making sure I have good clearances on everything. You could see on the top side, this is the passenger side of the frame. I had to clearance some of the coilover bracket because there is a bump on the frame where the frame has clearance for the air compressor for the air conditioner. As you can see on top here, I had to clearance the cross member back some so that the coilover bracket would lay on top of the frame. But once you have everything good and clean and lined up, make sure you have good clearance around everything. You can be able to tack weld it in place, take your coilover off, and then you can start welding the coilover mount in place. Now that I have the passenger side fully welded in place, I just repeated the process on the driver's side. I cut the coil spring bracket out of the way, got the frame good and cleaned, and as you can see right here, I'm checking fitment or how it lays on the frame. The driver's side is actually much easier because the frame is flat, so the bracket will lay up there. When you put your coil spring into place, you can do the mock-up and make sure that you have plenty of clearance around your upper control arm and all that so that everything will line up. And once you make sure that you have good clearances on everything, you can tack weld the upper bracket in place, remove your coil spring, and final weld the driver's side bracket in just like the passenger side. Now that the upper coilover brackets are installed, it's time to assemble the front suspension. So Chandler is installing the coilover. The lower bracket is made to bolt to the lower control arm where your coil spring mounting bracket was. It's kind of a tight fit in there, and we actually clearanced some of the coil bucket on the lower control arm to get the bolts and stuff to slide through. So it's really tight, so you just have to kind of fight with it to get it in and clearance one spot on the lower control arm. Once you get that clearance and get it in there, then it's just a bolt-in process, and then you can just assemble the rest of the front suspension. So one other thing we did to this truck after putting the coilovers on is actually clearance the inner fender on the front fenders of this truck. The truck sits so low to the ground that the tire actually contacts the inner fender. So we marked it out and then took a angle grinder and just started cutting the inner fender out of it. Be really careful with this because there is some other things inside the fender. So you got to be careful, make sure you're not cutting through anything or burning things up. And yes, Chandler is cutting the inner fenders on this indigo blue 2000 Silverado. His paint guy really loves his phone calls.
It's laying on the rack.
Go push it real quick.
Push what?
Push the truck down, see if it... Oh no, it's floating. All right, y'all, so we got the suspension put back together, got the coilovers installed. We've set this truck down on the ground and set the initial ride height. Once we get the truck driving on the road and everything, then we'll finalize ride height, kind of get it all dialed in. Also going to get the shock settings adjusted because what he's going to drive on the street is going to be a very different shock setting that he'll drive at the track. So that's going to be just as we drive with the truck and find out what it likes, what he likes as a driver, and what it likes at the racetrack. This we're really happy with. Once we get this truck on the road and get everything set up, I really like this setup. But before I wrap this video up, I want to give y'all a kind of a better explanation on why the spring rate matters and why we went with a lighter spring rate and a longer coilover shock. So I'll give it to you right now. All right, so a spring rate, what spring rate is a couple of different ways to measure it, but what it boils down to is how much weight does it take for a spring to compress 1 inch on a standard rate coil spring like this. Your variable rate coil springs, you'll have different measurements on how to rate those. I'm not gonna get into that because this is just a standard coil spring on a coilover shock setup. So whatever the weight is to compress the spring 1 inch is what your spring rate is. And this is a 650 pound spring. So it would take 650 pounds of weight on the spring to compress it 1 inch. All right, so I use this kind of anecdote or whatever to give you an explanation on why a lighter weight spring makes for a more reactive spring at the drag strip. So you take two springs side by side. You take a 100 pound spring and you take a 300 pound spring side by side, and you put 300 pounds on those two springs. All right. So your 300 pound spring is going to compress 1 inch. Your 100 pound spring is going to compress 3 inches down. All right. So you have more compression on that 100 pound spring. All right, so you remove 100 pounds off the spring. The 100 pound spring is going to move 1 full inch, while the 300 pound spring is going to move 1/3 of an inch. remove another 100 pounds, and it's going to move the 100 pound spring. It's going to move another full inch. The 300 pound spring is going to move a third of an inch. So you get where I'm going at. A lighter spring rate is going to react to weight changes more because it takes less weight to compress it, less weight to remove it. So what that equates to on the front of a pickup truck like this is there's a whole lot of weight up here. All right, well, the suspension is trying to help pick the front of the truck up. So it with a lighter spring rate that is compressed down because it takes more pressure to hold the weight. As you remove weight, where you have to remove so much more weight on a heavier weight spring to get it to move that 1 inch. With this, it takes less weight. You already get the suspension up an inch. The more weight you get off, is the faster the spring's going to help further weight up. And as the weight of the truck gets up, the center of gravity is going to move back. It's going to help plant the weight on the back tires and get it down the track. So that's why you run a lighter weight spring. The downside of that is in order to get the spring to hold the weight, it's got to be a longer spring so it can compress down to hold the weight. So in the factory setup on these trucks, the coil spring bucket is designed for a spring only. And they are a heavier weight spring than what you can allow. If you compress the spring too much, you get into coil bind, where all the coils will touch. And once the coils touch, it does all kind of bad things. Infinite spring rate, that's a very bad thing for your truck, and it also messes up the way the spring works. So you go into a coilover spring where you have part of the mount, top and bottom, is not usable because you have the way it secures to the truck on the top and like the shock settings and stuff on the bottom. So you're using up more space than just what a coil spring would use. So therefore, if you was to run a coilover in the factory location, you would end up with a very short setup. So doing this, removing the upper spring bucket, putting that in a long travel coilover up front. This truck uses all of the original pickup points on the upper and lower control arm. This truck has factory upper and lower control arms on it. It has a drop spindles on it, but that's just for the lower end of it. But the control arms are factory, all in the same pickup points. You take this truck to an alignment shop, they can do an alignment on this truck just like if it was factory. So it all works out well, and you have the longer coilovers, so you have the double adjustable coilover, so the better adjustability, and you have full length coil springs that are available at all kinds of different spring rates. So I love the fact that this truck is completely adjustable and tunable for all of the builds, all of the different ways he wants to drive this truck. And I know that Chandler has talked at length about different ways that he wants to run this truck. He really wants to see what it'll do at the drag strip, but he's really likes the idea of doing like autocross kind of stuff, or, you know, and twisting and turning road course type running. He wants to see what this truck will do in turns. That's why he put big brakes on it and the big tires on it. It's because he wants to do that kind of stuff too. So once he gets done, once he wants to change over from drag racing to road course racing, he can still use these coilovers at the track doing that. If he needs to change the spring rate, all he's got to do is change the spring out, put it right back on this coilover spring, and he's good to go. So I love this setup. It all looks nice. It works nice. I can't wait to see what it does at the track and get this truck playing out like a bass boat when it launches at the track. So I'm gonna wrap this video up here. I hope y'all found this helpful. If you did, make sure you hit like and leave a comment. And if you're looking for somebody to do this kind of work for your vehicle, give me a shout. I'd love to build stuff like this. I love doing this kind of work. So I hope y'all found this helpful and stuff. And if you want to see this truck at the track, make sure you subscribe so you can see the rest of this build and this truck at the track, so you see what it's going to do at the dyno, what it's going to do at the drag strip on the street, right here, Alley Cat Customs.